Welcome to literature class. Today we're going to be reading chapter 9 in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's on page 95 in the witch's house. So we left off in chapter 8 and Mr. Beaver was telling him all about Aslan and the prophecies about how Aslan's going to come back and defeat the White Witch and that they need 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve to sit in the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel for the White Witch's life and reign to be ended. And after they were done talking about all this, they realized that Edmund was gone. And Mr. Beaver knows that he's gone to the White Witch to betray them. And where we left off is that they realize the White Witch is coming after them and they have to leave immediately. So now we're going to switch to Edmund's perspective. In the Witch's House, chapter 9, page 95. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. No one was. Edmund was just imagining this. He just wants to be at the center of attention and then pay him more attention. They were just listening to the beavers. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for the meeting at the stone table. It was not good for the children. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Wonder why they feel something different. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half a djinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight and to be a prince and later a king and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do to the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me, anyways, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, but deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. So we can't be too hard on Edmund, because if you ever done something that you know is wrong, but you've told yourself, oh, it's not really that bad, and you tried to tell yourself all these reasons why it's not that bad, and you kind of convince yourself, but deep down you really know it's wrong, but it doesn't stop you because, like Edmund, you want something. You want that Turkish delight, whatever it may be. So he knows it's wrong, but that doesn't always stop us, even though we know it's wrong. It doesn't keep us from going after what we really want, even though we shouldn't. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar, he flipped up his collar to protect his neck. He turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow, and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks, and sliding down steep banks. And Barking, that means bashing his shins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. Silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends for the others. He hadn't happened to say to himself. So Edmund's miserable and is ready to go back. But right when he is about to turn around, he reminds himself, when I am king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be make some decent roads. And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of a palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private cinema, and where the principal railways would run, and about what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up. It came freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost as bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen when they first arrived at the Beavers, a small river flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up. But the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. How is snow falling on his back Peter's fault? But Edmund's doing whatever he has to in his mind to convince himself that what he's doing is the right thing. So he's not going to blame himself, so he's blaming Peter. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house, and the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunce's caps or sorcerer's hats, a long cone with a pointy hat. And they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. Shouldn't he be afraid? But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret, which means tower, turret after turret, to find the door. He had to go right around to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on, afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together, so he's scared. He stood there so long his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turned its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then will be my chance to escape. But still, the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now at last, Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. This should have given Edmund a clue that they knew what they were talking about with the White Witch, that she does turn people into stone. And they also said that she's evil. If she has stones in her courtyard, that should prove what the other people said as well, right? That she's a bad person. But Edmund doesn't think about this, or doesn't want to think about this. Perhaps this was only a stone lion, And as soon as he thought of that, he noticed the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course, it must be only a statue. No living animal would let itself get covered with snow. Very slowly, and with his heart beating as it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now, he hardly dared to touch it, but at last put out his hand very quickly, did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. And at the same time, there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Asa that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Who's afraid of Aslan? So again, he's trying to convince himself that he's doing the right thing by joining the White Witch. And he stood there, gloating, like bragging, over the stone lion. And presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip and then a pair of spectacles on its eyes. And he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on its face of this great stone beast still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up in the moonlight, that Edmund didn't get any fun out of jeering at it. So even though he's mocking it and jeering, he doesn't really get that much satisfaction out of it because it's mean and it's cruel and it's immature. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs and stone wolves and bears and foxes and catamountains, that means mountain lions, of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirit of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur and a winged horse and a long lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange standing there, perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still in the bright cold moonlight, that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Eerie means creepy. Creepy to go among all these once live people that are all stone. I mean, it's like a graveyard more than a courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard, and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. He raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, with all the hair bristling along its back. You know how, like, when dogs get riled up or cats, their hair stands on end? The hair bristling along its back opened a great red mouth in a growling voice. Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are. If you please, sir, said Edmund, trembling, so that he could hardly speak. My name is Edmund. I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia. Quite close, in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them? I will tell Her Majesty, said the wolf. Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life. And it vanished into the house. So stand still if you want to save your life. If you don't want to die. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold, his heart pounding in his chest. And presently, the gray wolf Morgram, captain of the police who arrested Tumnus, the chief of the witch's secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favorite of the queen. Or else, not so fortunate. So if the queen likes you, great. If not, you're in trouble. Kind of remember how you guys studied Roman emperors last year? You get the thumb up, that's good, but if the queen gives you the thumb down, like the emperor, you're gone. Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn, with a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. "I've come, your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "Please, your Majesty," said Edmund, "I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on the top of the dam, just up the river, with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she said. No, your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all that he had heard before leaving the Beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the Queen. "Aslan? Is this true? If I find you've lied to me—" Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the Queen was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly the same dwarf, whom Edmund had seen her with before, appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without bells." Why would she need a harness without bells? She's going to do something sneaky and doesn't want people to hear her coming. So read chapter 10 for homework.